Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and anybody listening, we're still here in Geneva, still looking out at the snow over the mountains. Day's coming to an end, and we've now got Lara Maughan with us. That's the correct way of pronouncing, is it, Laura?
Lara.
Okay, and I was focusing on the Maughan. Okay, right. Sorry, Lara. Lara's the head of Worldwide Airport Slots, and this is a subject matter now that I would think most people who listen in regularly wouldn't really know much about. So this is going to be one to listen to. Now, Lara has been doing this for 7 years, so she's an absolute expert. And I've also just heard that she appeared on BBC News, and that her young son waved and was very concerned that she didn't wave back. So we'll take it from there. So, Lara, how did you get into this particular position?
Yeah, thanks. So I started in airport planning a long time ago, back in London, and working for international firms, looking at airport privatisation, due diligence work, and extending terminal facilities.
Oh, very good.
So completely the other side of the business.
Yeah. And how did you get into...
Well, I loved skiing, and I have a husband that's even more mad on it, and after some bizarre conversation ended up living in the Alps, not far from Geneva. Commuted for a while doing my airport planning work, and then we decided we'd like to base here, and this position at IATA came up, so it all worked out nicely, and we've lived here ever since.
Fantastic. And what a beautiful place to live, huh?
Yeah.
Incredible, isn't it? And so now your position, do you want to give us a little bit of an outline as to how what you do impacts or influences or benefits cargo?
Yeah, sure. So IATA's involvement in airport slots is really to set up the policy and the process so that globally there's one way of allocating the airport slots, retaining the airport slots, and importantly that it's all done in a very fair, transparent and non-discriminatory way. So in terms of cargo, for us it's no different to any passenger flying, any scheduled flying. Yeah. The big difference is obviously cargo operators that have scheduled flights versus a large part of the freighter industry that's unscheduled.
Yep.
And so the process for slot allocation is very much centred on the most congested airports, and you don't need this at an airport where there is freely access. So it's about kind of carving up that capacity that's available and giving it to those operators to operate in an efficient manner. And that's why we have what we call the use it or lose it rule.
Yep.
Where the operator has to use their slot that's allocated 80% of the time that it's allocated for. So each slot is for a specific time for an operation on a specific day. So you have to operate every 10 o'clock arrival on a Monday, 80% of the season, to get that 10 o'clock arrival back for that Monday. Okay, and they're measured separately for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So this is largely in part for a carrier like DHL or FedEx that are operating very scheduled, routine, fixed operations. They can maintain their historics in a slightly more easier fashion than perhaps a carrier that's trying to get into these hubs for random operations, what we call ad hoc operations, or an operator that is assigned some kind of heavy uplift for a particular assignment and they can't get access at that hub. And that's why you see, I think, a lot of the large freighters using the less congested airports simply because there are no slots available for them on an ad hoc basis.
Okay, but I mean, it all makes sense. It's logical.
Yeah, I think the idea is that there's what sounds like a very technical process, and it is technical, and there are these independent slot coordinators assigned to allocate this process and then manage the process afterwards to check that the slots are used efficiently. Actually, the basis of it is quite simple, and it's essentially a reservation to use something that otherwise would be too busy for you to access at that time.
But the use it or lose it is a good principle.
I think so. It ensures efficiency, it ensures the right behaviours at these very congested airports, and it does maintain that actually while the operation's taking place, there's control over how many flights are operating as well, in theory. And we all know on the day things go very differently, but there is some logic behind the plan. And the capacity is very fairly allocated. So there's lots of criteria that are used by the coordinator to make sure that there is an ability for new entrants to access the market. It's not just about the incumbents that are there.
Okay, so that's the 20%, is it?
So there's 50%. Any new capacity or any new slots made available each season, 50% should be going to new entrants. So that's somebody that doesn't operate more than 6 flights already at that airport on that day. So there's ability to access even the most congested hubs.
I didn't even realise that.
Yeah.
So when you see in the newspapers when a carrier's having trouble and then somebody says the value of the slots, so obviously if it's in a really congested airport and they've got a certain amount of slots, there's a value to that.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about value, on one hand there's a monetary value, which honestly isn't the point of any of this. So the slots are allocated for free to everybody. There is no cost to the slot. And the reason of that is twofold. One, because it's meant to be a fair process. So you don't want there to be a price tag on a slot that means that only certain carriers can afford to access an airport. But also it's because the airlines and any carrier is undertaking a lot of other costs into the operation. So if you're at a very congested hub, there's possibly delays, all of these other issues you've got to deal with. So they're already paying to operate at that airport. So the slot is a free right, if you like, to access it. But when you talk about the value, the value comes from the investment you make in operating that slot. So for a freighter operation, it may be that you establish a whole hub at that airport, and the staff that you station there to go with it. You don't suddenly next season want to find out you haven't got any access to that airport, having invested in it. So there is a value in the slot, but it's not monetary necessarily.
Oh, so it's a real anchor. Also, when some of the airports are so congested, I mean, that's also opportunity as well from the cargo side and from smaller local airports to actually capitalise and turn themselves into a more cargo-focused, and there's less congestion there, not just for slots, but less congestion with traffic, with access.
Exactly, so and it's a good point. The surface access issues around these congested hubs is obviously a primary concern for those operating a kind of just-in-time or time-critical operation. So the likes of, say, DWC in Dubai versus actually going into Dubai Al Maktoum Airport, there are obviously some attractions in using that other airport, which has freely available capacity, and you can set up your full operation there and not be succumb to the mainstream Dubai city traffic. So that's the same in any city.
Yeah, I know them both very well. And also Liège.
Yeah.
Which has benefited from
they've had some. And I think there's a balance though. So this is why the slot process doesn't only focus on passenger operations and prioritise them. It is fair access for cargo as much as passenger services, because every passenger hub is moving belly hold cargo, and that needs to be moved onto other modes of transport. And so at all of these key hubs, you will also see the likes of these freighter operations, because they need to transport some of that belly hold.
But there has to be a degree, surely, that if you have a passenger aircraft coming in, they're going to do a lot more shopping in the duty-free, etc., and in the facilities, which brings more revenue, potentially.
I think there is, unfortunately on the airport side, some priority for certain operations, And again, that's why an independent coordinator
is so important.
So years and years ago, the airlines did the coordination themselves. So in the UK, British Airways allocated the slots at those airports, or Qantas allocated the slots, or Ansat in those days in Australia. But obviously now you could not believe that would be the situation. It's almost unfathomable. But in the same way, the airport shouldn't be allocating them either.
Exactly.
Because they have their own priorities. So this is why this independent coordinator is so important.
Yeah, we need as many people as possible looking after cargo. Good. Now, another thing, and acronyms and WWASG.
Yeah, the Worldwide Airport Slot Guidelines. It was the WSG, and we've added this A, which is the Worldwide Airport Slot Guidelines.
And is that to bring them in line a little bit? And
this is
make them a little bit more
neutral? We
have
a constant issue in that I think there's a misunderstanding that slots is only about those very operational slots that you hear the pilot say when you're 15 minutes late out of a European airport, or we've got a slot restriction. This isn't anything to do with those slots. So they're ATFM slots, and ours are what we call
and
airport
for listeners,
slots.
ATFM?
Air transport flow management. So they're like ATC slots that they give on the day to regulate the flow. The slots that we're talking about are allocated 6 months plus in advance, season to season. Yeah. And we call them airport slots because it's about the capacity at that airport, and it's a slot for that airport. But also the changing the naming kind of is a signal that the whole community has now launched a new slot board. So it was governed by the airlines and the coordinators, but now the airports are part of this slot board. So we have an even representation of 7 members of global airports, global airlines and global coordinators. And they are now responsible for governing, managing, and developing slot policy globally.
And what have been the biggest changes or developments in the last, say, 5 years?
I think we've seen a continued number of airports moving to slot coordination. So there are now 200 plus airports globally that are slot coordinated, and a similar number that are what we call level 2. They don't have slots, but there's some kind of management of the schedules there. So I think this is only going to increase. We're going to see more and more congestion. There's not enough capacity being built to keep up with demand. So more and more level 3 slot coordinated airports. There's a lot more focus now on access. It's a highly competitive market. Everybody wants to access the same airports for the right reasons. That's where the demand is. But that means that there's also, over demand. So the coordinator only has, say, so many slots, and they can only allocate those to the carriers that have requested them. And unfortunately, there's a lot more carriers requesting slots than there are slots available. So
they'll become victims of their own success, and then you'll see carriers going to different regional airports, and then those airports will start to grow.
Yeah, so I think this is just going to become something that proliferates. We used to say slots was a short-term solution to a capacity crisis. I think this is actually the solution to a capacity crisis, but the real solution is more capacity.
Yeah, but it'll be the trigger. So once it gets to a certain level, then people have got to look at realistic alternatives.
Yeah.
It's also good. That'll develop further. Now, you mentioned about charter aircraft and full freighters.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, and again, we have to relate to the situation that the industry is in at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I think there's going to be an awful lot of demand for charter aircraft now coming up soon, because I think the charter business, the cargo business, will start to recover sooner than the passenger business. So how's that going to be now with slot swaps or slot preference or?
Essentially, what IATA asked two weeks ago now, when the outbreak was of the coronavirus outbreak was clearly moving just from a sort of China-Asia market globally, that we needed what we call a slot waiver from the regulators globally. This isn't unprecedented. There's been slot waivers in place before for SARS or the financial crisis. I don't think we've asked previously, though, for it to be this quick and on this scale. This is a global crisis now, clearly no containment, and therefore every market is being impacted. And on the cargo and freighter side, I think what became a reality very quickly was actually there was some more uplift in some of these markets for them, because the passenger flights had been reduced. The belly hold wasn't available, and so actually they were able to move into that space. But like you say, in an ad hoc charter fashion, moving their schedules around to pick up different loads in different hubs. So the whole network changed for them overnight as well. So on the passenger side, you see cancellations, and on the freighter side, you're seeing a very complex set of situations that they need to change their network for. So the slots that they already held essentially become almost unworkable, because they're replanning their network day to day. And this is why we asked for a slot waiver. So essentially what it does is say that you don't need to use that slot 80% of that season. We're taking the usage requirement away. So you retain the right to operate at that airport when everything's back to normal. But while we've got this current situation and complete disruption to the industry, we just want everyone to be able to operate where there is demand and make the best use of what there is. Obviously, there are going to be cancellations, but when you talk about the freighter side, there's actually some different dynamics and potentially more need, a greater need for them to be flying.
Well, that's good, and it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, so they can pick up slots that are returned from the passenger services that are cancelled and make good of those slots for retiming existing schedules or completing new movements in their network.
Oh, well, that's good, and most people
flexibility.
You wouldn't think of that.
Well, it's kind of common sense once you start thinking about it. But
Which
I think
this is not common.
This is why we've had to explain to the regulators that a slot waiver isn't about stopping flying. It's about freezing what was their plan to be operated this season, including the growth that was planned this season, and sort of keeping that frozen for next year now, for next summer, and this summer being much more flexible, but with the certainty that you're not damaging your existing network.
No, that's good. And that must be very well received, huh?
Not as well received as we'd like. Not as quickly received as we'd like. So,
because?
A number of regulators have been really quick, understood the impact, and are moving very quickly to put these waivers in place. Others we're having to still convince that this is the right way to go.
Well, because they see opportunities.
I think it's a misunderstanding. I think some areas perhaps don't see the impacts in the same way that we are. Everything is being impacted, and demand has dropped in an unprecedented fashion. And I think it's taking a while to establish that as a common understanding across the industry. There was a lot of discussion about market to market, so why not just alleviate China and Italy, say? But the demand profiles have changed everywhere, and from the cargo side, restrictions have been put in place. So there may be a restriction, say, now we've seen the restriction the US has imposed overnight on European traffic. Not on cargo, importantly.
Which Mr. Trump cleared
and
up.
not on crew, importantly. But other areas are restricting crew. So if you've been, say, in Italy in the last 14 days, you're not allowed into certain states, even as crew. So the carriers are having to deal with this massive complexity of travel restrictions on crew, which is particularly for cargo and freighters. And so they're having to rework entire schedules just because they don't have the crew available.
But that's crazy. How do they get around that?
I'm glad I don't have to deal with that part of the industry. It's a logistical nightmare at the moment trying to fathom this out. And this is why it's so important that the slots that were rigorously maintained are frozen, and there's flexibility now to do what you need to do and change those slots because you may have operated from Italy to Bahrain and then on to Iran and then into China, say. Well, that whole network needs to be reworked now because of restrictions in place. So.
But how will they do that with crews? Because once you've done one flight, you're in the same position.
Yeah, so they're having to be really careful about how the crew are operating, and they're almost, I believe, keeping some crew for certain operations. And that indeed also means that they've got to reschedule because that aircraft now can't be used on, say, the worldwide schedule that they had, and it's perhaps just doing a point-to-point service. Yeah, so it's a huge impact, and against actually some larger uplifts in some markets, but also massive change in flow. So I understand a lot of the freighters are seeing much more they were initially more traffic going from the EU to Asia rather than the Asia to the EU, and that may be changing again.
Yes,
but it's those dynamics that we need to be flexible enough to accommodate because this is having a global trade impact now.
Yeah, I'll have to check. My daughter flies with British Airways, so I'll have to see what she's
huge supply chain issues if you don't enable this part of the business.
No, it's really I didn't think about that before.
See, it is interesting. Some of the slot stuff.
No, it is. You can see it's interesting with your enthusiasm and engagement. No, it's brilliant. Problems. Yeah. What do you see as problems for the future, with the exceptions of the current situation?
So putting the unprecedented situation aside, if we're talking about the normal, the kind of normal that we know and understand, more and more congestion, meaning more and more access issues. So we've already seen, say, Amsterdam Airport's been a key crisis point for the cargo sector in the recent years. Yeah. And there's ways around some of the priority issues, and I know they're looking at local rules. Ultimately, we need more capacity. There needs to be more airport capacity. And I don't think it's about trying to move certain types of operations out of congested hubs because, like we say, there's some synchronization between passenger and cargo that you need. But there's also the ability to move, like you said, to Liège and bring full cargo operations into play. So I think where the carriers can move to an airport where there are less restrictions, they always will. Yeah. But it's all about demand. So those key hubs play a key role where the demand is. Yeah,
and then you've got the conundrum with developing existing highly demand airports. Mm-hmm. So the issue with Heathrow is one as well.
Yeah, and rules being put in place where, say, you can't get historics anymore for a cargo operation. We don't agree with that. That shouldn't be the case. But it is the case more and more in some of these big hubs. They're choosing that the carriers operate on what they already hold, but they're not allowed to get any new historics. That's really disadvantaging one sector of the business.
Yeah, but you can see a side of argument on both sides.
I can see where the airports are laying their priorities.
Yes, exactly. exactly. Yeah.
But I think that's why we have to continue to fight, for this part of the industry to make sure they do have the access potentials. And there's huge value in freight and these logistics, and we need to enable that supply chain to be maintained through those hubs.
Oh, and especially at the moment now, and when things start to ramp back up again, because everybody needs product, everybody needs equipment,
and part of it is, I think, explain, like we've had this challenge recently at Heathrow with the development of the third runway, which obviously is not moving forward very quickly right now. But when the planning was being looked at for that, the night flight issue is predominant for cargo as well. So something we're really involved with is night flight restrictions. And trying to quantify the value of those night flights, because even if they're passenger operations with cargo, that belly hold freight is often some of the most time critical cargo being carried. Pharmaceuticals overnight from Asia in for medical use that day, they're no good 24 hours later. You need to have a slot that is maintained at 4 a.m, say at Heathrow, or 5 a.m. at Heathrow. Coming in from, say, Hong Kong, if it comes in at 8 o'clock, it's too late for the day. So there's a big kind of, I think, review at the moment on night operations, and rightly so. We need to be as environmentally friendly as possible.
Yeah, but also if it's done in smaller numbers and it's not as frequent.
Yeah, I think there's existing operations, and there are much cleaner, quieter aircraft now.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
One thing that we I suppose, I don't know whether to say support, because the night flight issues is a huge issue, but the quota count system is something that's been put in place and does work fairly well. It's they take the noise impact to the aircraft and assign a quota count to it, and that score is assigned with your slot, and you have a quota to deal with for your operation for that season. So that's part of the slot process at those night restricted airports.
Yeah.
And it's a reasonable approach. It balances the community's needs with the aviation industry's needs.
Yeah, no, I had some experience with noise abatement issues in Brussels, and my goodness me, you know, the way the aircraft, the route it takes at banking, how the captains, I mean, it's amazing what goes into it.
Yeah, and some of the new profiles
where they pick up the noise, the noise measures.
Yeah.
It's almost as if people put it there on purpose to pick it up. But,
there are some there's some funny results coming when some of these consultations are going on. You have to ask what it is that's being measured when you see a 787, for instance, being recorded as noisier than some other aircraft.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's part of our role as well with our environmental and sustainability team, to look at the scheduling dynamics and the night flight issues as well.
Yeah. We keep saying, like, every time I look at an aircraft and like talking to yourself now, you see a different dynamic that goes on around that aircraft, different types of business, every single thing associated. It puts so many people in work.
Yeah.
It creates so many opportunities. It creates so many technical development advantages. It's amazing.
Yeah. And I think at the moment there's obviously a quite negative view on the industry associated with the outbreak, and it's just, you know, it's a shame when you get these blips, if you like, in the industry's growth. It is a shame. The industry
always
they tackle and they come out the other side, and I think that's why we all have to rally together. So we've just had a call with the airport community on slot alleviation, because everybody understands that we all need to do what we can to maintain the industry through these hard times, so that growth comes back again.
The good thing is, though, when such challenges, whether it's national or in this instance global, it does make people start to pull together and do the right thing, and you know, some good comes out of all of these challenges. So touch wood, it'll be a big change.
Keeps us out of other trouble.
Yeah. Talking about out of other trouble, now what would you, if you had a magic wand, what would you like to do that would make things different in the next few years?
I suppose the politically correct answer is that I don't have a job anymore. Because there's enough capacity. You don't need slots. If you've got enough airport capacity, you don't need slots.
But that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen, is it? So my job's safe, at least for now. Or at least the slot process is safe for now. I think if I had a magic wand, we would have global alignment on this. So we didn't need to continue to explain the value of maintaining one type of process, and you don't get these pockets going in other directions. You just have everybody working to the same process and policy, because it's an absolute nightmare for the carriers. They're operating between all the regions of the world, and if they don't all do it in the same way, it's like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces all the time. So that would relieve a lot of the pressure and this happens every season. So it's a nightmare that doesn't go away. So if we could get alignment globally, that is a big frustration, isn't it? Sometimes some of the things that we're involved in are so complex
if you sat down and you did it on a whiteboard or as part of a new strategy, you'd put it in and it would be a guideline or a rule, and that would be
that
it.
everyone just do it. And one area that I think we've got a lot of scope to develop, and it's probably times like this where you start thinking that the role that technology can play, and we all know can play now, is to speed up the evolution of the slot process becoming quite dynamic. So you don't need an email system or messaging anymore. You know, if you want the slot at a certain time, the computer systems
and are the computer systems that advanced now?
Yeah, I think we can get
AI
them to that place. Yeah. We can get them to that place. And then you could see, along with the ATFM, the ATC type improvements that are coming along, a lot more dynamics in this part of the industry. But I think there's a will to get there. It's just, as always, things like this happen with this outbreak and it sets everything back again. So.
Yeah, such a shame, all the poor people involved. Incredible, huh?
Yeah.
Amazing. Now, as far as where would you say is the most advanced region with regards to understanding, appreciation and awareness, and why do you think that is? I
don't want to say advanced. I'd say the most mature, maybe. I don't know if that's a slightly different
word
way
I'm used to, yeah.
Mature in that they've had coordinated airports for a very long time and have a regulation that is pretty much aligned with our slot guidelines, and is well understood. I'd say Europe. Yeah. They have half the world's coordinated airports. So of those 200 airports, 100 are in the EU. So I would say they're the most mature in that they've had to deal with this for a long time. That's not necessarily a good thing. And the region that's now coming up in terms of the numbers of coordinated airports that are needed is Latin America. Huge growth in the numbers and demand there, and the airports are really meeting their crunch points. So Mexico City, Lima, Bogota, and Bogota's an interesting case because it's a huge cargo airport. But they're slot coordinated now, and we fought there for the fair access for the cargo carriers as well as the
successfully
carriers. I think the regulation still has a little bit of work to do. Put it that way.
But it's such a shame. Cargo is such a valuable part of every single airline, yet people just they overlook it and they don't see it as being such a.
I think we forget that we rely on it when you're making your Amazon order now, and you wonder how that parcel got to you the next day.
Exactly.
What goes into that, and the reason they can be sure they get it to you the next day is because they may have one of those precious arrival slots early in the morning, and they know that they can get those shipments overnight to that country and deliver your package.
There's so much pressure on delivery times now. E-commerce, it's amazing. Right, Lara, I personally have learnt a lot. Okay, and you've got a very, very contagious enthusiasm. I could honestly, I'm not joking. I could.
That's
listen.
a bad word at the moment, isn't it?
Oh no. I could listen to you for a long time. Okay, you've explained lots of things that I didn't know, and there's things that I didn't even think of, and you've also made it very interesting.
Good.
Is it that interesting?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah. So how much of your time do you actually spend, focusing on those particular issues, and how much of your time do you focus on developing new ideas or new?
So we've got a team in IATA of 5 people, and we're all just working on slots. So it takes up a lot of time. So we run a conference twice a year, which isn't really a conference, it's a working meeting where everyone comes together to get make sure that their slots are allocated as far as they want, that they can get those. Like speed dating, essentially. The coordinators sit at the tables and the airlines all run around, the cargo carriers run around and have 15-minute appointments. And so we have one person just running those events twice a year. And we have the rest of us working on the regions, developing with the governments, the regulatory policies, working with the airports, working with the airlines, the coordinators. And we're working, say, in Brussels, in Washington. Any government consultation we have to get involved with. We're working with the environment team. So my day is all about slots.
That's amazing.
All day.
Those conferences now, twice a year. When's the next one?
June in Montreal.
And if that gets cancelled?
Yeah, we're hoping that it won't. We are looking at contingency plans, as anybody sensibly would. Yeah. But we hope that doesn't have to come into play. I think probably at the moment the most likely outcome is some people won't be able to travel, whether that be because the business can't afford them to travel or because there's restrictions in place. So we look at whether we can put in place like phone booth type infrastructure that they can then dial up and hold their meetings remotely, virtual 15-minute and 30-minute meetings. We hope it doesn't come to that.
It's going to change an awful lot of the way people work, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Thankfully, we have the technology now to be able to do that.
Yeah, but it's still, I mean, we do.
But it's not the same. And we do get asked all the time, why isn't the whole slots conference just go virtual? I can't believe in this day and age you need everybody there on site. But you speak to anybody that is there and they will say the efficiency they get from having every single one of those 200 coordinated airports represented in one room and being able to say, I've moved my slot by 10 minutes at Heathrow, can I go and move it in Sydney? Or I've moved, because then you've also got to go to Singapore, say, and move the slot there. So you've got to go to 3 coordinators just to move that one operation. And if you can do that in the space of 30 minutes, essentially.
But to get that organised on, it is different.
And also because the slot swaps that you mentioned, they're enabled by people having real relationships. So slot swaps are done through the carrier's representatives and them knowing that they've got a 10 o'clock and they want a 10:30 and they're willing to make that swap. So it's done in a manner that enables that. Probably eventually that won't be the way it's done, but actually 10
artificial intelligence, and it'll just say this is what
10 years ago, I think we were writing up that this might all go virtual, and I still don't think we're there yet. I don't think anybody would say that it's right yet to do that. So.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm not sure, what have we done? 37 minutes, 38 minutes? 31 minutes. For me, it's flown by. For me, it's flown by. And no, but seriously, you've made it very, very interesting and very, very enjoyable. Enjoyed your time.
Good.
Thank you so much, Lara. And I'm sorry I focused on Maughan instead of Lara. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.